In the book, Freddie eats a hot dog in a very unusual way where he first sucks off all the ketchup and then he eats the bun and then he puts the hot dog itself in his pocket. That is purely because that is what my grandpa Lee told me he used to do on his way home from the JCC. He would buy a hot dog, suck off, I think he said the mustard, eat the bun, and then he'd put the hot dog in his pocket, and then he'd eat it later with the lint and the fuzz from the jacket pocket. And Anna just watches this and says, like, boys. But I could not have made that up. It's just a story from my grandfather.
This is The Book of Life. I'm Heidi Rabinowitz. The Length of a String is a middle-grade novel about Imani, a black Jewish girl adopted by white parents. She wants to know more about her birth parents, but she also learns to connect with her adoptive family in a new way when her great-grandmother leaves her a diary about her escape from the Holocaust. I spoke by Skype to author Elissa Brent Weissman, who won a 2019 Sidney Taylor Honor Award for The Length of a String in the Older Readers category. Tell us just briefly, what is The Length of a String about?
The Length of a String is about a black girl named Imani, who's 12. She's preparing for her bat mitzvah, and she's working up the courage to ask for a very controversial bat mitzvah gift. She is adopted, and she doesn't look like anyone else in her family. She doesn't look like anyone else in her town, especially her Hebrew school, and she's always wanted to know more about where she comes from. So she would like, as a bat mitzvah gift, to search for her birth parents. Meanwhile, her great-grandmother, or adoptive great-grandmother, Anna, dies and leaves all of her books to Imani and her brother and her cousin. And Imani finds among those books a diary that Anna kept the year she was 12, which was 1941. And in that year, Anna was sent by herself from a large family from Nazi-occupied Luxembourg to live with a new family in Brooklyn, New York. So part of the book is the diary itself, which takes place mostly in Brooklyn in 1941. And part of the book is Imani in present-day Baltimore reading that diary and starting to think about family and her place in her family in a new way.
What inspired this story?
It really came from three different places. Imani's story was inspired by my best friend growing up. Her name was Lauren, and she was adopted from Mexico, and she had a sister who was adopted as well from upstate New York. I was thinking a lot about them and their experience. They were both Jewish. They went to Hebrew school with me, but they didn't look like anybody else in Hebrew school. I grew up on Long Island in a very Jewish town. So thinking about what that might be like to be the only black girl in Hebrew school or the only Mexican girl in Hebrew school. The inspiration for Anna's story came initially from an interview that I caught on the Diane Rehm show on NPR, where listeners were calling in talking about being Holocaust survivors or children of Holocaust survivors. And one of them called in and said that her father was a survivor. His parents had saved up money to send away the two oldest children. And when they got to the boat, they were told the price just doubled and now they could only send one. And I heard that story and thought about that child who got sent, the man's sister who ended up going by herself. And that got my mind going for Anna's story. And I thought, well, if I were to tell a story like that, I could actually incorporate some memories from my own grandparents. At the time, I still had all four of my grandparents. And one night, my grandpa Marty, had started telling me all of these stories from his childhood of growing up in New York, working in the fur business. And he really was just opening up. He's normally very quiet. And I had thought to myself, I wish I were recording this right now. And here was an excuse to go and sit down with my grandparents and record them on video talking about their childhoods in New York in the 1940s. And a lot of their memories and experiences became part of Anna's story. So I kind of put all of those things together. And when I started writing, I realized that they all were meant to go together all along.
It's kind of a funny title, The Length of a String. Can you explain what it means?
Yes, I had such a hard time thinking of a title for this book, but at one point the diary that Anna keeps is written as a series of letters to her twin sister Belle, whom she had to leave behind. And she talks about how being twins, she imagined they had a connection. That was the way you tie a string between paper cups and whisper secret messages. And she wonders now that she's leaving and crossing an ocean, how long can that string stretch? And so I liked that image of this string unspooling across the Atlantic Ocean and connecting Anna and her twin sister Belle back in Europe, but also unspooling across generations and connecting Anna and Imani and, all family and all of us together, the questions of what makes family and what makes connections and that idea of how long can a string go.
Okay, it's a nice image. It's very nice to get some representation of adoption through this story. So, what issues around adoption do you want readers to be aware of? And is there anything in particular about interracial adoption that people should know?
I personally am not adopted, and neither am I an adoptive parent. As I mentioned, I spoke a lot with my friend who is adopted, and I spoke with many other adoptees as I was writing the book, which was really interesting to hear all of their experiences. And then after the book was written, I had a number of sensitivity readers reading for adoption questions, reading through the lens of race. Two of those were a mother and daughter who is a transracial adoptee preparing for her bat mitzvah. The main thing I took away from speaking with so many people was that everyone's experience is unique and everyone's perspective is unique, which of course makes sense because they're all different people. I was shocked to learn from my friend Lauren. I've known her my entire life, and I was incredibly nervous to speak to her about her adoption. And she was just laughing at me because she thought it was so cute how nervous I was. She said that anytime anybody finds out she's adopted, it can be a stranger on the street, they suddenly start asking 10 million incredibly personal questions and ask her if she's searched for her birth parents. And when she says she hasn't, they try to convince her to search for her birth parents, which I found completely crazy that somebody would be so forward. And I've got a scene pretty early in the book where this happens to Imani, and that scene came from this conversation. One of my sensitivity readers said that a lot of people who don't have personal experience with adoption, we tend to, from the outside, romanticize adoption, which is why we think that everybody should search for their birth parents, or you might have this history you don't know about. I mean, there are so many different situations. And so I was trying to capture some of that in the book. I guess if there were just one thing that I took away from it that I would want readers to take away from it is that, well, I made the mistake in an early draft of using the term real parents instead of birth parents or first family. Mm-hmm. And that was quickly pointed out to me, rightfully so, that the adoptive parents are the real parents. And I was able to correct that, thankfully. I think that's very important. And that also, I guess, that there's no right or wrong way to go about some of these issues. I've heard some really strong reactions to the character of Imani's mom. Imani had a closed adoption, and she has wanted her whole life to know more, but she's terrified to bring it up with her family because her parents do not talk about adoption at all. Even though it was a transracial adoption, Imani says at some point, I wonder if my mom even remembers I'm adopted, or she somehow thinks that she actually gave birth to me. They just never really talk about it. That changes as the story goes on, but a lot of people have had strong reactions of how could Imani's mother not be expecting these questions. She's very selfish. She adopted a child. She should be talking about it more. And maybe to some degree that is true. We get a little bit more of her perspective towards the end of the story. One of the adoptees who I spoke with when writing the book was similar to Imani in that she always wanted to search for her birth parents, but she waited until both her parents died, and she didn't start looking until she was 50 years old because she didn't want to upset her mom. So I think that there's a whole range of experiences.
Were there any particular issues that you learned that were unique to transracial adoption?
One thing that I discussed with my editor that I didn't end up including in the book at all because I didn't really feel comfortable enough and have enough knowledge to tackle it was the issue of Imani's hair. African American hair, black hair is very different from a lot of white people's hair, and I thought that would definitely be something that would be one thing in terms of transracial adoption that would come up with a white parent adopting a Black child. I chose to have the adoption in the story be transracial because I thought it was important that she feel like everybody could tell something was different. I think that the story wouldn't be quite the same if Imani weren't constantly being asked, "What are you?" which is something that people experience in America who are a person of color at all, who aren't white. It's a very sort of jarring question. You know, Imani, she talks about when people say, "What are you?" she normally answers that she's human, or sometimes she'll tell people she's Jewish just to make them more confused because she doesn't look the way most people expect a Jewish person to look. And so I wanted that added layer of everything. If she were adopted and she were wondering about her birth family, but she could more easily pass as being the biological child of her parents, I don't think that those issues would have been, in her mind, for the character I created, quite as important to her.
Okay. Talk about the research that you did in order to write this book.
I did so much research. I mean, normally I write a book, just me and my imagination and maybe looking up small things as I need to look them up. But I'd never written anything historical before, so that was kind of intimidating to me to start. And I already spoke about the research I did on the contemporary story and talking to adoptees, transracial adoptees, having the sensitivity of readers. And then for the historical component, I watched some movies from the 1940s. I started by reading books that were written around that time. I didn't really want to read any historical fiction because I didn't want to be influenced too much by how other people wrote historical fiction of the time, but I wanted to get a sense of the language and content and maybe what Anna herself might have been reading. I looked at a lot of books about fashion from the time because I was also thinking how Anna's story begins in Luxembourg and moves to Brooklyn. And I was thinking about what she would notice that was different between Europe and the US. But the large majority of my research for the historical story was talking to my grandparents, which was really such a joy. And I sat them down and got them on video talking about their childhoods. And if I ever had a question, I could just call them up and ask them, or I was curious thinking what might Anna's apartment look like in New York. And so I asked my grandma if she had any photos of the house where she grew up in Brooklyn, and she sent me some pictures so I could see, you know, what the carpet looked like and what the wallpaper looked like and the furniture. Oh, another thing I did too quite a bit was I used the New York Times has what's called Times Machine, and you can see the New York Times online from any day in history. So anytime I say in the book what the weather is like, she goes to see a Broadway show, all of that stuff is completely accurate to the day and time that I was writing about. And just one story I like to tell is I was writing and it was September and I thought, oh, maybe she could go to a baseball game. And I looked it up and it turns out at that time was the World Series, and it was a Subway Series between the Brooklyn Dodgers and the New York Yankees. And from what I could tell online, it seemed like kind of an important game in baseball history. And so I called my grandfather, who's a big sports fan. And I said, "Hey, Grandpa, do you remember the 1941 World Series?" And he instantly just said, like, "Are you kidding me? Mickey Owen dropped the ball and Tommy Hendricks hit a home run and those bums blew it." And he just remembered it exactly. And so Anna listens to that game on the radio, which turns out it was a really big game in classic baseball history.
That's great. And I didn't know that about the New York Times time machine. That's awesome.
It's really cool. You can see what the weather was that day. You can see like the movie schedules. What was most helpful, more so than the articles, was the advertisements. So I could see what products were being advertised, how much things cost. And I was surprised to find that all the products and brands are the same as today. I mean, I knew like Coca-Cola and Pepsi, but it was also, you know, Palmolive soap and beech nut gum. It was kind of all the same things we're still using today.
Hey, Book of Life listeners, Heidi here. I interrupt this podcast with an important announcement. I'll be hosting a Book of Life live show in Woodland Hills, California, near Los Angeles, on June 17th, 2019, at 5:30 p.m., as part of the Association of Jewish Libraries' 54th Annual Conference. Guests include Joni Sussman of Carbon Publishing, and author/illustrator/musician Barney Salzberg. famous for his book Beautiful Oops. The live show is free. Conference goers get in automatically. All others must RSVP by June 10th to be admitted. Email me at bookoflifepodcast@gmail.com for details. And now, back to your regularly scheduled podcast. Are there any personal touches that are hidden within the story that nobody would know about except you or maybe somebody who's in your family? Are there any secrets that you can reveal to us?
Yes. I always have a lot of those in my books. My kids now, my daughter is 8 and she's started reading some of my books and she loves hearing these little details because a lot of them relate to our family. There is a character in the book named Freddie, and he is Anna's first friend when she arrives in America. And he is sort of what I imagine my Grandpa Lee to be like when he was a kid, is kind of what that character is. And Freddie in the book, he eats a hot dog. Anna goes with him to buy a hot dog, and he eats it in a very unusual way where he first sucks off all the ketchup, and then he eats the bun, and then he puts the hot dog itself in his pocket. That is purely because that is what my Grandpa Lee told me he used to do on his way home from the JCC. He would buy a hot dog, suck off, I think he said the mustard, eat the bun, and then he'd put the hot dog in his pocket, and then he'd eat it later with the lint and the fuzz from the jacket pocket, which I think is so completely ridiculous. And Anna just watches this and says, boys, but I could not have made that up. It's just a story from my grandfather.
Did he like it better with lint on it, or why would he do that?
I suppose. We asked him, I've watched this video clip many times where my grandma says to him, why did you do it that way? And he just says, why? It was my system. It was just my system for eating a hot dog.
Huh. Okay. What read-alikes would you recommend for someone who wants more books like The Length of a String?
Oh, that's a great question. Well, obviously there are so many books for young readers that take place during World War II, during the Holocaust. One review said to pair it with Number the Stars, which was a really big compliment. Any sort of story, I guess, that has a diary component or 2 time periods. The Night Diary, which just won a Newbery Honor, also was published by Dial, my publisher, the same year. And when I first heard the description, I said, oh my gosh, they sound really, and that takes place during India's partition, but it also involves a diary. I haven't actually had a chance to read it, so I can't say if it counts as a read-alike or not. I don't know. I'll have to think on that. I'm sure I'm going to hang up and think of, 10 books off the top of my head.
Well, if you do, send them to me. So I found this excellent list of author interview questions at BookFox, a website for writers. I want to randomly use one of these questions right now, so go ahead and pick a number between 1 and 50.
Ooh, I will pick 17.
Okay. 17. The question is, what authors did you dislike at first but grew into?
Ooh, authors I disliked but grew into. And is this when I was younger or now, or?
It could be any time in your life.
Any time in my life. The one that pops into my head, I really don't mean to sound pretentious with this answer, is Charles Dickens. Well, I had to read Great Expectations in 9th grade, and I hated every word of it. And then I had to read A Tale of Two Cities. I think it was the summer before 10th grade, and I was so resentful and so sure I was absolutely going to hate it. You can tell he was paid by the word, and it's so wordy and it's so dull. And then I ended up really loving A Tale of Two Cities. But I don't think I've ever read any Dickens since. So I don't know that it counts as coming around to liking the author after all.
What was it about Tale of Two Cities that changed your mind?
It ended up being a really good story, exciting story. And I don't even have a specific memory of it except just truly dreading having to read it and being so angry about it and begrudgingly starting it and then getting really sucked in.
Okay. Well, maybe now that you're thinking about it, you'll go back and give it
I
another
may.
shot.
My New Year's resolution last year or the year before was to read more classics. I didn't read any Dickens that year, but I did read a lot of other authors whom I'd never read before, and with mixed results.
Well, from that experience, was there any particular classic that you think everybody should try out?
My best discovery that year by far was the author Shirley Jackson. She is amazing, completely blew me away. She's best known for The Haunting of Hill House, although I actually think now that I've read almost everything she's written, that's my least favorite. But the first thing I read of hers that year was a book called We Have Always Lived in the Castle, and it was unlike anything else I've ever read in my life, and it was spectacular. So I highly, highly recommend Shirley Jackson. She's best known for the short story The Lottery, which most people read in high school. But apart from these kind of dark, scary books like The Haunting of Hill House and We've Always Lived in the Castle and The Lottery, she also wrote these really hilarious, delightful essays about parenting that were published in things like Good Housekeeping at the time, back in the 1950s about, and then they're collected into two memoirs called Life Among the Savages and Raising Demons, and they're hilarious. They're really light and really funny. So she had this breadth of talent to her as well.
All right, very cool. Was there anything that you edited out of The Length of a String that you still wish you'd found a way to keep in?
Yeah, this book, it took a long time to write. And then whenever you're writing, well, this was my first time doing it really, but I had the contemporary story and a historical story and they intertwine. And so it just was a challenge to keep the balance between them. And at one point then the book got very long and then I had to cut it back. So there was a lot that I cut. And one thing that kind of sticks out to me that I had to cut was I just had a diary entry where Anna was at Rosh Hashanah services. She talks about reading the Torah and how Abraham is going to sacrifice his son, and God says, okay, you've proved yourself to me, you don't have to do it. And Anna, thinking about how her parents sent her away and all of that, she says how she doesn't like that story, and wouldn't it be a better story if the test were for Abraham to say, no, I won't sacrifice my child for anything, to stand up to God. I didn't end up keeping it. It just didn't quite fit, and the book was long and we had to find things to cut, and nothing else really depended on it. But I just really liked that diary entry and that question that she has and her take on it, that I wish I'd been able to keep it in.
Interesting. That sounds like a kernel of another story
perhaps.
That maybe you can use some other time. I read the first book in your Nerd Camp series, and I found it really heartwarming. Can you talk a bit about that series?
Sure. Yeah, The Length of a String is really different for me. It's for slightly older readers, and it's more serious than my usual stuff is like Nerd Camp. That's what probably I'm best known for. So Nerd Camp is about a boy named Gabe. He's 10, and he is going to the Summer Center for Gifted Enrichment, which is a sleepaway camp where you have to take a test to get in. And Gabe loves learning. He thinks this is going to be awesome. But he's also getting a new stepbrother. His dad's remarrying a woman who also has a son who's 10 named Zach. And Gabe has always wanted a sibling. He just wants himself and Zach to be best friends. But it turns out Zach is like this super cool surfer guy from California who, if he discovered that Gabe was going to the sleepaway camp, would think he's a nerd. So Gabe kind of hides that fact from him. He lets him think it's just a regular sleepaway camp. So most of the book takes place at camp, and Gabe is having a great time. And it was really fun to just write summer camp with a nerdy twist. He's got these quirky bunkmates, and he has kind of this frenemy named Amanda, and he's taking classes and doing nerdy things. But in the back of his head, he's wondering, can I tell Zach about any of this? And he's keeping a logic proof to figure out, am I a nerd or am I not a nerd? So if, in case you need any more evidence as to where the answer lies. Again, it's actually the first of 4 books in that series. So I've gotten to know these Nerd Camp characters very well, and they have all sorts of fun, nerdy adventures.
Are there any Jewish characters in Nerd Camp?
Gabe is Jewish in my head. I don't think you ever discover it. I don't think there's even any clues that he's Jewish. I at one point had, I can't remember which, I think it's in Nerd Camp 2.0. Gabe is taking a class about heroes, and he thinks of the story of Hanukkah, but I think I ended up having to take that out. But usually all of my protagonists are Jewish, and The Length of a String is the first time that that identity is really at the core of the story. But I always imagine that they are, with the exception of probably the Nerd Camp books. There are lots of just little mentions and references that convey that they are Jewish to the reader. I would imagine that Jewish readers would catch them and hopefully be happy to see that. And I wonder if non-Jewish readers, if they'd even register. I don't know.
Well, I always get a kick out of those kinds of hints of, like, sort of stealth Jewish characters.
Yeah. It's not so much that I mean it to be stealth, so much as, that's my experience. There were so few books when I was growing up that had Jewish characters that if I caught one of those little references, and I can only think of one time that happened in the book Anastasia Krupnik by Lois Lowry, that I just got so excited to see a Jewish character on the page. The other exception would be All of the Kind Family by Sydney Taylor, which their Jewish identity was a big part of that book, and I loved that book, and that was a big part of the reason why I loved it.
Is there any particular reason why you don't make it more explicit in Nerd Camp?
I don't see how it would fit into the story. That's not what the story's about. And it takes place during the summer, so unless he were going to a Jewish summer camp, there aren't really any ways, or I guess unless Gabe were much more observant than he is, I imagine him probably to be a Reform Jew, to even work it in. I think it's important to have Jewish characters on the page, but also for all readers, Jewish and non-Jewish, to just have them exist, but that not be the point of the story. And so the story comes first, and I'm not really sure how I could work it in. In Standing for Socks, Farah is the main character. She mentions something about Hanukkah gifts. In my book, The Short Seller, Lindy's sister goes to Hebrew High. She talks about having her bat mitzvah money, things like that. But in Nerd Camp, there just didn't seem to be a way to work it in.
Let's talk about Tikkun Olam, the concept that we can all help to heal the world. Is there some way in which The Length of a String helps to heal the world?
I hope so. I think reading books helps heal the world in so many ways, just in general, because reading a book is really the ultimate act of empathy, getting to experience something through somebody else's eyes, somebody else's head, somebody else's heart connects us all together. And The Length of a String is so much about those connections and how family is about so much more than blood, and thinking about where we come from and what that means and who we are and who we want to be. So I hope that this book gives people something to think about and hopefully even talk about and maybe want to research their own family history.
Taking the concept of Tikkun Olam further, what action would you like to invite listeners to take so that they can also help heal the world?
One of the best parts of writing this book for me was sitting down with my grandparents and talking to them about their childhoods and hearing those memories. And so I would invite all of you to sit down with someone in your family and someone from a different generation, if possible, older or younger, or maybe a little bit more distant from your immediate family, and talk to them about their childhood and see what similarities you can find, what differences you can find, and what you can learn. And if at all possible, if you can get it on video or record it on audio, you'll be really, really glad that you did. Since I did those recordings and since the book came out, one of my grandparents passed away in May, and it just makes it that much more special to have had that experience with him and now have this video of him sharing those memories to have forever.
That's lovely. Alyssa Brent Weissman, thanks so much for speaking with us.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
I'm Jonathan Auxier, the author of Sweep, the story of a girl and her monster. I'll be joining you soon on the Book of Life, and I'd like to dedicate my episode to George Brewster, a 12-year-old boy who died in 1874 and whose death sparked the Chimney Climbers Act that led to labor reform, which is central to my book.
If you enjoy the Book of Life podcast, please become a patron at patreon.com/Book of Life. Leave a review on iTunes or a comment on our blog at bookoflifepodcast.com. You can also like our page at facebook.com/bookoflifepodcast. Follow us at twitter.com/bookoflifepod. Email us at bookoflifepodcast@gmail.com or leave us a voicemail at 561-206-2473. The Book of Life is a podcast service of the Feldman Library at Congregation B'nai Israel in Boca Raton, Florida at cbiboca.org and is supported in part by the Association of Jewish Libraries at jewishlibraries.org. Our background music is provided by the Freilach Makers Klezmer String Band. Thanks for listening and happy reading.